still so many unknowns around this virus.
Not only will America dig itself out of this hole they put us in, we're going to build back, and we're going to build back better.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis all about the Democratic Convention. Join me each morning for up-to-date information from Washington Post reporters, followed by commentary from prominent Washington Post columnists and contributors. We're starting this morning after the Democratic Convention with the man we started with, Dan Balz, chief national correspondent, veteran political reporter. And joining the conversation is the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler. Dan, Glenn, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning.
All right, Dan, I'll start with you. Give me your initial reaction to the speech last night by former Vice President and now Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden.
Jonathan, I thought it was a very strong speech, probably one of the best speeches the former Vice President and now Democratic nominee has given in his very long career. This had been a pretty successful convention up to last night, but all conventions eventually depend on the performance of the nominee. And so there are questions about, whether Biden was going to rise to that moment, and I think he did. I thought it was thematically strong. I thought there was enough policy in there, but not too much. And I thought the delivery was quite forceful. It answered questions that I think that the Trump campaign has tried to put out there that Biden's not quite up to this moment. I thought last night he was up to the moment. I'll say one other thing about it. This convention has reinvented what conventions will be in the future. It was out of necessity, but I think they've shown a new way to do it. One of the things that this convention showed is that there is a value in short speeches. This was probably one of the shortest acceptance speeches in modern times, and I thought that Biden benefited from that. He was able to keep it on a level and on a plane that I thought was more effective than if he had gone into a lengthy laundry list of the kind of thing we've seen when speeches go on for 30 minutes or 40 minutes, or in the case of Bill Clinton in 1992, 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm. I want to get you to look ahead before I come to you, Glenn. Look ahead to the Republican National Convention. Dan, what are you after having seen the 4 nights of the Democratic Convention? What are you expecting to see from the Republicans next week?
My guess, Jonathan, is it will be quite a different convention. For one, they have not done the kind of production work that the Democrats spent months putting together. This will be next week a much more of a live event, and without some of the packaging and therefore some of the entertainment value of it. I think the other thing we know is that while it is called the Republican National Convention, it will be the Trump National Convention. Trump will be the centerpiece throughout, and they will probably have some tricks up their sleeve to try to top what the Democrats did. I think the other aspect that we should anticipate based on everything we've seen from the campaign so far is there will be a relentless attack against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Democrats in general. I mean, it will be there will be a lot of negativity. Not that there weren't attacks all week from the Democrats aimed at President Trump, but I suspect the tone of it is likely to be different than what we saw this week.
So, Glenn, as Dan just said, Vice President Biden's speech had policy, not too much and not too little. So with your ear as the fact checker, what did you glean or what did you pick up on from Biden's speech?
Well, actually, as a fact checker this week, I was awfully frustrated because the short speeches meant less facts and meaty things that we could explore. I was looking back 4 years ago, about every night of the Democratic Convention, we'd have about 12 items that we could pick apart. But because of this convention, they spoke much more in generalities. So, for instance, instead of saying 500,000 people a year go bankrupt because of medical bills, which is a problematic claim. They just said many people face financial problems because of health care. So that was a problem for us. And in Biden's speech last night, there was one case where he used a raw figure, the number of deaths the United States has, to say the U.S. is the worst in the world. When if you look at it, the way public health people look at it on a per capita basis, the U.S. ranks maybe fourth among the major nations most affected by the coronavirus. And otherwise, it was picking apart, the Vice President Biden brought up Charlottesville and how President Trump talked about very fine people on both sides. And you can debate as to whether or not President Trump forcefully denounced white supremacists and Nazis, which he did at one point and then seemed to take it back. So it's much more subtle. And it just wasn't great for us fact checkers this week.
Glenn, I was going to say, I can hear and see the frustration on your face and in your voice that you have a job to do. And it's really frustrating when someone makes it kind of difficult for you to do your job. And that's with the Democrats. Now, I'm going to have you do what Dan did. Fast forward, look into the future for what you anticipate your job will be during the Republican convention. Do you think you will have more work to do?
I would think so, definitely. Every action in politics results in a reaction. And of course, we have been documenting the many misleading statements that President Trump has made during his presidency. In fact, I'll make a pitch. We wrote a whole book called Donald Trump and His Assault on Truth. And so I think Democrats, cognizant of our Pinocchio ratings, have tried very hard in this election to say, well, we're up against a guy who misleads all the time, so we're not going to do that. And they adjust their language to make it more difficult for us to call them out. In the case of the Republicans and Trump, past this prologue, I imagine the president in particular in his acceptance speech, it will not be much different than the many other speeches we have fact-checked. And generally, there are 50 to 60 misleading or false claims that he makes per speech. And I have no doubt he will not disappoint me in living up to that reputation.
Glenn, can you remind me, I have a printout here of my notes from your column today, but you have a disclaimer at the top about the reason for not giving Pinocchios during conventions. Do I have that right?
Right, we do these roundups. I mean, we give Pinocchios in a standalone column where we dig deep in a particular statement, which of course also allows for the person being fact-checked to make their case. In the instance of a convention situation, it's often hard to do that. So we just feel, and we're just doing quick little takes, 2 or 3 paragraphs. So just to be fair to everyone, we don't award Pinocchios at the convention. I mean, in the case of President Trump, if he says a number of things that we have already previously fact-checked, we will note, well, this claim previously earned 4 Pinocchios. 65 to 75% of the statements Donald Trump has made that we have fact-checked have earned 4 Pinocchios, our worst rating. So we'll note that, but we're not going to have the Pinocchios at the bottom.
We've got less than 2 minutes remaining, Glenn, and I have a final question for you too, Dan. But Glenn, what's the biggest whopper told by the president that he keeps repeating, if you have it at top of mind?
Well, the one he has said the most, more than 350 times, is that he created the greatest economy in the history of the world before the coronavirus. And that's just absurd on its face. There are many recent presidents, such as Dwight Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, Bill Clinton, that on just about every metric had better economies than what President Trump had in his first few years as president. And actually, before the coronavirus, the U.S. was headed into a manufacturing recession. So that's something he says constantly, and it's simply false. More specifically, in the campaign, he keeps saying Joe Biden wants to defund police. Actually, that's the exact opposite of Biden's policy.
And Dan, I'll give you the last word. What's the watchword we should be looking for when it comes to the Republican convention?
I think, Jonathan, the key to the Republican convention, and frankly, the key to the Trump campaign going forward, is whether they can find a consistency in their message, whether it's a consistency in their line of attack against Joe Biden, which they've not yet been able to settle on, or a consistency and a discipline on the part of the president. I mean, a lot of Democrats are mindful of the fact that in 2016, in the final stages of the campaign, Donald Trump became a more disciplined candidate. He's never going to be entirely disciplined, but compared to what he had been earlier on in the cycle, they regard him as somebody who found some discipline and stuck with it. That's been missing in this election year, and that's the key that he's got to figure out and settle on in order to bring himself back into the thick of this race.
Dan Balz, Chief National Correspondent, and Glenn Kessler, Washington Post's fact checker. Thank you very much for being here this morning.
You're welcome.
Thank you, John.
Next up, my colleagues on the Washington Post opinion side, contributing columnists Hugh Hewitt and former Congresswoman from Maryland, Donna Edwards. Good morning.
Good morning, John.
All right, Hugh, I'm starting with you. Last night was Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden's acceptance speech. What was a highlight for you?
Well, I thought it was a very good speech. I think he did very well. Matt Continetti I've just finished 3 hours of radio, and everyone I had on agreed he gave a very solid speech. Chris Coons was actually the exact sort of introduction I think that the vice president needed, emphasizing what a good guy he is. My only experiences with him are the same. So if anyone had a doubt about Joe Biden being a good guy, that's gone. But as I listened to Dan and Glenn, I also think it was a little bit low-carb diet when it came to policy. And this is going to be a high-carb campaign when it comes to policy. So the highlight is he got out of it without a mistake. But the best thing for a Republican would be, and this was repeated, he took away that low bar of expectation. He delivered a good performance, and therefore that low bar of expectations is gone. And I'm looking forward to the debates. I'm looking forward to the RNC, actually, significantly. I hope they learn from this. The Democrats did a good job of a Truman Show sort of presentation, staying in the blue bubble of the Democratic Party. And I'll tell you one thing, Jonathan, I played 4 times this week AOC's entire speech. 4 times on my conservative center-right radio show, I played her entire speech. I love the speech. I would play it in the Republican convention because that's the Democratic Party.
Seriously, Hugh?
Yes, I played it 4 times because she represents the Democratic Party.
I get why you played it 4 times. I'm just arguing with your notion that she is the entirety of the Democratic Party. Congresswoman Edwards, you were Democratic Congresswoman from Maryland. What was your view of Joe Biden's acceptance speech? And react to Hugh.
Well, first of all, I think that Joe Biden really did deliver the speech for the moment. I thought that, he struck at the ideals of the country, and I think everybody wants to feel that inside. And so he struck that chord. I mean, he talked about, without actually, saying, I have integrity, he talked about his life in a way that we understood his integrity, his sincerity, and his competence to get the job done. And I thought it was a terrific speech. And, I thought a lot about this. I think some of these speeches were totally ideal and appropriate for the kind of convention that was conducted online in almost an empty room. And I think that Joe Biden's speech went over so well in living rooms and bedrooms and dens and kitchens that may not have come across that way in a crowded arena. And so I thought it was great. And as to Hugh, look, I'm a progressive. I'm left of center. I completely can embrace Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And I think that if you look over the course of the 4 days, you really did see the depth and the breadth of the Democratic Party, the diversity of the party, not just in race and ethnicity, but in gender and age across the board. And I think that is reflective of who the Democratic Party is. And then add to that the sprinkle of Republicans who are also supporting this candidacy, it shows the breadth and depth of the United States of America.
Hugh, last night, our mutual colleague, Joy Reid, last night, after the Biden speech, I thought had an interesting take on who Joe Biden was talking to in his acceptance speech. She said she thought he was talking directly to white working class voters, talking to them about why he is okay, why he is a viable option for them to either come home to or to turn away from President Trump. What do you make of that? Who do you think Joe Biden was talking to?
Well, Joy's always perceptive, and I think she hopes that's who was listening. There was a Today Show interview with Craig Melvin this week where he talked to an unemployed steelworker who remarked upon the fact that all of Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, the old steel industry remains MAGA country. I'm from northeastern Ohio, which borders on Pennsylvania. There is no chance of Ohio flipping to Joe Biden, and I think Western Pennsylvania is still deep blue. So I think Joy is expressing her hope as opposed to the reality. The reality is we're replaying the 2016 election. It's going to be a turnout election. It's a jump ball. The Minnesota poll has got to scare people who support Joe Biden. And when he reached last night for the Charlottesville canard, and I heard Glenn Kessler hedge, fact checking is a very subjective business. I do not believe Joe Biden told the truth about that last night, and I believe if that comes up on a debate stage and the debate commission gives us even remotely fair moderators, remotely fair, they will call him on it in the way that Candy Crowley got in the middle of President Obama and Mitt Romney in 2012. We will see how long this endures, but it's the blue bubble for both parties or the red bubble for the Republicans. You've got to make sure you're doing a fact check against reality, and Joy last night was in the blue bubble.
Wait, Hugh, 1 second. Charlottesville canard? Could you please explain what's the canard?
The canard is that he did not say there were very good people among the neo-Nazis. He's explicitly denounced the neo-Nazis in the same press conference. I believe any fair presentation of those remarks would point out that the president explicitly denounced the neo-Nazis.
I would go to Glenn Kessler's fact check because he writes about that. And the point of the president's remarks was that there were very fine people within the neo-Nazis. And Glenn points out that actually there were none. Donna.
Jonathan, I can't let that. That's not what he said, but we can put that aside for another time.
I'm telling you. I'm sorry, Hugh. I'm telling you what Glenn Kessler wrote in his fact checker column in the Washington Post today. Donna, what do you make of Joy's analysis that Vice President Biden was aiming his message directly at white working class voters?
Well, I think that there were a lot of messages in there. And to the extent that he was doing that, he did it without alienating the base of his party, without alienating Black women, without alienating young people, without alienating progressives. I mean, he spoke to the hopes and dreams and aspirations of people that are shared across these lines. And so, look, this election is going to be on the margins. We know that. Coming out of 2016, I don't pay that much attention to public polling. But the fact is that the 2016 election was won or lost on the margins in a couple of states. And I suspect that this election is going to be about how Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can inspire and turn out their voters, make sure that people vote in whatever way makes them comfortable, that they can cast their votes. And I'm convinced that because of who Joe Biden is, who Kamala Harris is, that this is going to have a deep impact on voters who turn out, and some who sat home in 2016 but are willing to figure out a way to cast their ballots in 2020. And, when you look at Joe Biden's speech last night, I think he spoke on a higher plane. He wasn't in the dirty details. He was saying, who are we as Americans? How do we reclaim our democracy? How do we own our democracy? And I think people are going to respond to that.
Let's look ahead to the Republican National Convention next week. Hugh, you talked about Democrats being in the blue bubble. What's the red bubble next week going to look like?
A lot of China talk. I talked to Ronna McDaniel on the air this week, Jonathan. I suggested they do a lot more.
She's the chairman of the Republican Party.
Good Good pickup, Jonathan. You're a TV guy. The fact is that they need to do better than the Democrats did in terms of putting more people on the set. There's a reason that we have 3 people on the set right now, and it's because broadcast requires more than direct-to-camera messaging. My suggestion was to put the president in a room with Martha McSally, Tom Cotton, Mike Gallagher, and Congressman Dan Crenshaw, combat veterans of the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Navy, and talk about the defense rebuild that had to be done after President Obama's tenure as commander-in-chief. And that I would put President Trump in with energy people on the Energy Committee. I would have him in conversation a lot more than they use Joe Biden, because when it comes down to it, it is a choice between the vice president and the president. And so I would highlight in a lot more minutes in the prime time the president than the Democrats chose to highlight Vice President Biden. I will add, Mike Pence is so different from Kamala Harris. I can't wait for that debate. But Kamala Harris has been my choice for this ticket for 2.5 years. So I'm so glad she's on it. Finally redeemed most of my predictions for the Washington Post opinion for 2.5 years. But she gave a very fine speech. That's going to be a lit debate.
Okay, Hugh, it frightens me actually that you were rooting for Kamala Harris to be a part of the ticket, and not in a good way. Well, I mean, why were you?
Oh, in a good way. I think she was the strongest candidate by far in the field. I've watched her for 10 years in California. She is much better than the campaign she ran. Much, much better than the campaign she ran.
Hugh, we found a nugget of something to agree on. I absolutely agree with you. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go on.
No, I will turn it over to Donna now, because I think the Republicans have got to play to defense, national security, and the judges.
Donna.
Look, I think, one of the challenges for Republicans, if you contrast that with Democrats, there were so many kind of real people telling their stories, and they were uplifting. They were hopeful, and we got to see them, and we got to see them as they defined who Joe Biden is. I'm not really sure, as the names have come out of some of the cast of characters that are going to be at the Republican convention, whether they have that contrast that really tries to uplift his character to the extent that anyone can do that. And so I think for Republicans, I don't agree with you at all. This is not a choice election. This is a referendum on a president who's been, as described by any number of the speakers over this last week, a failure, and described by Vice President Biden as a failure. And he's going to have to explain to the American people and defend his handling of the COVID response, his handling of the economic recovery. He's going to have to explain caging children. I mean, all of these things, I think, are displaying that there is going to be a referendum on Donald Trump. And I think the beauty of the Democratic convention was not just highlighting the downsides of the Donald Trump administration, but uplifting the voice that Joe Biden and the leadership that Joe Biden is going to bring, and competence to government again. And I think all of those things are going to be in stark contrast with the Republican convention, and it's going to be noisy.
Hugh, let me have you. I want to have you pick up on something Donna just talked about. Real people telling their stories, and it made me immediately think about the couple in St. Louis who had their guns on their lawn as a Black Lives Matter protest walked by. What kind of story is the Republican Party, and in particular the president, trying to tell by having that couple speak at the convention?
Oh, the Second Amendment is a huge issue in Western Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Maine. I want people to understand. I believe, Glenn could check me, Maine is the highest per capita gun ownership in the United States. Maine has got a congressional district electoral vote up for grabs. Colorado, Arizona are pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment states. Wisconsin, Minnesota are pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment states. Whatever one thinks of what this couple did, and I haven't really studied it very much, I don't have much of an opinion on it. I do believe that the Democrats have more explicitly embraced gun confiscation, and Beto O'Rourke being anointed the gun czar by Joe Biden will be, I'm sure, brought up repeatedly by the Democrats. So here's the interesting thing about next week. whenever I write a column for the Post, the comments always are about what I didn't write about. Why didn't you write about Steve Bannon? Why didn't you do this? The Republicans get to pick what they want to talk about next week. They're going to talk about Beto O'Rourke being in charge of gun policy. They're going to be talking about the fact that no fracking in Pennsylvania, no guns in Wisconsin, no shipbuilding in Marinette, Wisconsin. We get to talk about what we want to right now. The Republicans are going to pick what they want to talk about. It's going to be those three debates. And I hope the Debate Commission provides us fair moderators.
I hear you on that, Hugh. And I hear you on the point about the Second Amendment. But Donna, one thing that Hugh did not address when it comes to that St. Louis couple with their guns on the front lawn is who they were pointing their guns at. The Black Lives Matter protesters. To your mind, when you saw the news that they were invited and will be speaking at the Republican convention, what message did that send to you?
Well, it's pretty shocking. I mean, because I think it sends a message that to all of those protesters, and keep in mind these are protests that span across the country, that was intersectional, that crossed so many race and gender lines. That the couple was pointing their guns at Americans. And this didn't have anything to do with the Second Amendment. This had to do with intimidation, with threats. And I think the message that sends on the podium of the Republican National Convention is that in order to win, Republicans are willing to threaten everyday Americans for exercising their First Amendment rights. Bad messaging, in my view.
Hugh, one of the things that we've been, the commentary surrounding Joe Biden's speech in particular, but the convention, the Democratic convention in general, is that the whole message has been reaching out beyond the Democratic base, telling people, come on in, the water is fine, vote for Joe Biden. How does President Trump expand beyond his base? Or does he not care to expand his reach to voters who are beyond his hardcore base?
Oh, I think he needs to win the same states he won before, and perhaps add one or two more. New Hampshire and Minnesota are the two that they've targeted outside of what he won in 2016. And I think it's very important to keep those electorates in mind, and he is with his fracking and his energy policy. But I have to go back and say it's very dangerous to take the commentary you saw this past week. I'd ask either of you to reflect on, did you see on any network a pro-Trump voter or a pro-Trump analyst talking about what was going on? I try and bring on Democrats and Republicans on my radio show every morning so that I don't end up in a bubble. I think that was such a thick bubble that Democrats are reassured, and yet not having mentioned China, not having mentioned Israel, the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, the UAE-Israel peace agreement, they left themselves open to a massive counterattack from reality. The reality of Donald Trump's 4 years, not his rhetoric, but the reality of his achievements. And when I heard Glenn in the prior thing, I know that the sainted Glenn I think he's a wonderful reporter, but I think he's simply wrong about the best economy in history, judged by GDP. And I think Donald Trump's going to talk about the best economy in history, and I'm going to say he's right, and it's not a fact-checkable Pinocchio. And the people in the blue bubble are going to say it is a fact-checkable Pinocchio, but the people who got a job in the last 4 years are going to agree with Trump.
Donna, can you address Hugh's contention that the Democrats were not dealing in reality?
Well, I mean, I think that what you heard at the convention is the reality of 170,000 Americans who are dead, the reality of 30 million people who are sitting at home unemployed, who are going to be watching Republicans talk about the best economy in the history of the world. And I think that people's real lives and their experiences are going to be a direct and stark contrast to what they're hearing from the president and from his allies. I think when I heard at the convention, for example, talking about that bubble, when I heard, John Kasich and Susan Molinari and other Republicans and a cadre of national security advisors supporting Joe Biden, I think like a lot of progressives, I was like, oh man, I can't believe that this is happening at a Democratic convention. But I stepped back from that and I asked myself, what kind of America does Joe Biden want to build? And he wants to build one that's inclusive. And I saw that reflected in the convention, even though if you look at the platform and you look at the policies, I don't have to change anything about what I believe or I support in order to embrace bringing people on. And I think that that's what's absent from Donald Trump. He's shown no desire for 3.5 years of adding to his base. And so I don't expect that that's going to change in the last quarter.
Hugh, I'm going to give you the last word. Next week, as I've mentioned and we've been talking about, is the Republican convention. The Republicans get their turn to tell the American people why the president should remain in the White House. In one sentence, one short sentence, what should we be looking for next week from the party and from the president?
Emphasis on achievements. And I love what Donna just said about John Kasich, and I'll borrow from Lloyd Benson. John Kasich, I know him. He's a friend of mine. John Kasich is not a swing voter. John Kasich did not vote for Donald Trump. Meg Whitman didn't vote for Donald Trump. Colin Powell didn't vote for Donald Trump. It's the swing voter that you've got to get out and that you've got to persuade. And I think the one line is focus on that swing voter. Who do you trust to rebuild the economy a second time? And do the 22% rise in housing starts in July reflect what's coming? I think they do. I think people have more confidence in Republican economic policies than Democratic.
And with that, we got to go. Hugh Hewitt, Donna Edwards, thank you very much for joining me for Washington Post Live's first look at the Democratic National Convention and forward-looking to the Republican convention. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. Come back next week, Tuesday morning at 9, when we'll give you your first look of the Republican National Convention. Join us then and head to Washington Post Live for more, WashingtonPostLive.com for more information on other programming. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you for joining First Look. We'll see you next week.